Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me. If you can't, or if there's any problems, please let me know in the chat function below. My name is Nikita Burke and I'm the Programme Manager with Evidence Synthesis Ireland. And Evidence Synthesis Ireland is an all-Ireland initiative funded by the Health Research Board and the Research and Development Division of the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland. And ESI also includes Cochrane Ireland. Our aim is to build evidence synthesis knowledge, awareness and capacity on the island of Ireland. And we have a number of key activities to support that, one of which is these monthly webinars. So I'll introduce our host for today, Ashrita Saran, while she's setting up her slides there. And 1 second, let me turn on her video. And we'll be able to see her then as well. So Dr Ashrita Saran has been working as an evidence synthesis specialist with the Campbell Collaboration since December 2016. And she's also the editor of Campbell International Development Coordination Group. She's an epidemiologist by background and is trained in systematic reviews and information science. And at Campbell, she has led the development of Campbell discussion paper on evidence and gap maps, which is what she's going to be talking to us about today. She's over 6 years of experience in public health research and evidence synthesis, and her research areas of interest include education, child welfare and international development. So today Ashrita is going to talk about what evidence and gap maps are, how they're used and initiatives in the Campbell Collaboration in this area. So we'll have about 40 to 45 minutes of a presentation, and that will be followed by about 10 minutes of a Q&A. So if you have questions, you can put them into the Q&A box down at the bottom, and you can do this as the webinar is ongoing, and then I will moderate the session at the end with Ashrita to help answer some of those questions. So I'd like to thank Ashrita for coming on here today and looking forward to hearing your webinar. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Nikita, and hello everyone. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to having an active participation. So I'll try and keep my presentation well within the time so that we have more time for a lot of questions. So today, as Nikita has mentioned, that I will be talking about evidence and gap map. I hope you can see my screen clearly and you can hear me also clearly. If it's not the case, please let me know. So some of the topics that I will be covering today would include, obviously, I'll take you through what exactly are evidence and gap maps. I'll take you from where it all started, a little bit of the history of the evidence mapping, some of the key examples by different organizations that deal with evidence mapping, how are they different from reviews, and some of the key innovations in mapping that Campbell has been involved in. So let's look at this graph here. It's basically a content versus scope graph. So as we all know that systematic reviews, they are considered to be of the highest quality evidence. At the same time, they are, highest in terms of their content, because the aim of systematic reviews are usually to collate all the evidence together in the form of impact evaluations. And they help us identify what interventions are effective, what interventions are not effective. So they are considered to be highest in terms of their content. But as you move further, you can see that the content is decreasing, but the scope is increasing. The reason why, because the main primary purpose of evidence mapping is to collate all of the evidence together in a particular sector or a subsector. And hence they are considered to be very, very broad in their scope. So this is why evidence and gap map, they are very, very broad in their scope, as well as what they include in our systematic reviews, as well as impact evaluations. I'll tell you as we move further in terms of a slide, how they, they vary in their scope and what are the type of, evidence that you can include in evidence mapping. So before I go further on what are the content and how do we set the scope for an evidence and gap map, let's look at what exactly are evidence and gap maps. So they are considered to be a systematic presentation of all the available and relevant evidence for a particular sector or a subsector. If you imagine an Excel sheet in your mind, it's basically in the form of a matrix where your rows form your interventions and your columns forms your outcome. So if you look at the two figures that you can see currently on the screen, the first example is by an organization called International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. The second example is by Campbell Collaboration. So as I mentioned, a typical evidence and gap map will always be in the form of a matrix of outcomes and interventions. And the number of bubbles that you see on the screen, it tells you the type of evidence. We will learn further on how do you quality rate and how these color codings are done. But this is a typical evidence and gap map. And this example is by a Campbell evidence and gap map, which is called Mega Map. Apart from the matrix, an evidence and gap map also has additional filters in terms of study design, location, or population subgroup. This is basically because we make evidence and gap map as interactive and as visual as possible. The purpose of these additional filters is basically if you want to identify an evidence only related to, for example, randomized control trial, or only related to a particular region like South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, you can do that in the online interactive versions of evidence and gap map. I'll show you one example after this presentation is done. So we can actually play around some of the filters and see how they actually work for an evidence and gap map. Typically, the primary purpose, as I mentioned before, of an evidence and gap map is to tell us how much evidence is out there for a particular topic or for a particular sector. The aim is not basically to tell what the evidence says. But again, there are certain organizations that develop their evidence and gap maps that also shows you what evidence says, for example, in terms of effect sizes in different areas. I'll show you one example of that as well. So I've been talking about evidence a lot. So in an evidence and gap map, this evidence can be global or for a particular region like South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. This evidence can also include impact evaluations or primary studies and systematic reviews. And also an evidence and gap map can include evidence of different types. For example, the most common example of the type of evidence are effectiveness studies, but that is not the only thing that you can do for an evidence and gap map. There are a lot of examples where we have innovated this evidence mapping into other areas like process evaluation or collating different type of evaluation in a particular country. I'll take you through some of these examples as well. Coming upon to the history of evidence mapping, or where it all started. So what happened in the year 2003, Center for Disease Control, or CDC organization, they approached the Yale Prevention Research Center to do a systematic review on complementary and alternative medicine. But instead of doing a systematic review, Yale's Prevention Research Center, they came up with a very innovative and replicable methodology, which was a 9-step procedure called as evidence mapping. So that is the first time when someone coined the term called evidence mapping. In the same year, Epicenter also developed a methodology called systematic mapping. It was somewhat similar to what Yale's Prevention Research Center, and the common thing was both of them actually used descriptive reports to showcase their evidence mapping. The breakthrough for evidence mapping and the first time the visualization of evidence mapping came in the year 2010 when 3I, that is the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, they came up with this methodology called evidence gap map, and it was the first visual and interactive version of evidence mapping. After that, a lot of organizations, they modified this methodology and have been developing evidence mapping in their own fields or on their own sectors. A similar methodology was again developed by Epistemonica's Foundation. This is again a very innovative, and they collate all the relevant literature related to health. Campbell Collaboration came into evidence mapping in the year 2017, and from then on, we have innovated a lot in terms of the type of evidence that you can include in evidence mapping and the different sectors. So I'll show you all of that innovation in my subsequent slides. So you can see that there's not one single organization that does evidence mapping. There are a lot of organizations. To be precise, there are more than 14 organizations, or maybe more than that have developed these evidence mapping, and they modify it in their own way and in their own sector and topics. So this particular graph is taken from the organization 3I on their map of maps. So as you can see in the graph, from the year 2010, there has been a subsequent increase in the area of evidence mapping. So you can see that the number of maps being developed from the year 2010 has subsequently increased. Now, importantly, you have to understand that evidence mapping follows the similar methodology that you can follow for systematic review. So they are as systematic reviews. So they follow a pre-specified protocol like a systematic review. They have to have a systematic search strategy that is a part of your protocol. They have to have a clear inclusion and exclusion criteria, which are then systematically applied to include or exclude a study. And they have to systematically report all the eligible studies that you have included in the map. The most important point for an evidence and gap map that sets it apart from any other evidence synthesis product is that it involves a framework, and the construction of a framework is a critical stage in any evidence and gap map. Now let's look at some of the key examples of evidence mapping by different organizations. The first one is by 3IE, which is very well known. I hope most of you must have seen this. So again, this follows a typical framework or typical matrix. You have interventions as your rows and you have your columns as your outcomes. Apart from that, they have certain filters that you can see on the top, that like filters for region, country, study design, and population. They also follow a typical traffic light signal to quality rate their studies. The bubbles that you see here, currently you can only see two colors here, which is gray and red. These quality rating tells you the type of evidence it is. Typically the gray colored bubbles, they tell you that these are impact evaluation, and the red colored bubbles tell you that these are systematic reviews. And these quality rating basically is done using a traffic light color signal in the 3IE maps. Like the green colored bubble will tell you it's of the highest quality. The orange colored bubble will tell you it's medium quality, whereas red tells you it's a low quality. Moving on, this is another example by an organization called SiteSaver. Again, they use the methodology similar to what 3IE does, and it's a modified version of that. So in the SiteSaver map, they have like two axes. The x-axis shows you the strength of the evidence. So the strength of the evidence tells you basically, it's in the form of strong, inconclusive, and weak. The strong evidence basically tells you that the intervention used in that particular study has a strong evidence in favor of the outcome. Whereas inconclusive tells you it has a mixed effect, and weak tells you you cannot make out. Okay. And the color coding that you see here, it follows a similar manner as that of 3IE. That means the green colored bubbles that you see here on the screen are of the highest quality. The red is of low quality, and your orange colored bubble or the yellow one that you see, these are of low quality reviews. And they do the quality rating using show checklist. This is another organization called Evidence-Based Policing Matrix, and they develop evidence map in somewhere called 3D pattern. So obviously it is accompanied by the report, and you can't actually make this out on the screen. But what they do is basically they collate evidence related to crime, and the different axes, for example, the x-axis tells you the type or the scope of the target. For example, the intervention is for individual, or the intervention is for group, or the intervention is community-wide. The y-axis will tell you the specificity of the intervention. For example, if it's a general intervention or if it is a focused kind of an intervention. General intervention, for example, law banning guns in the city, whereas a focused intervention would be for a specific group. For example, any intervention that prevents youth gang membership. So that kind of a thing. The z-axis tells you the level of proactivity. For example, if you see the highly proactive intervention would be those, for example, that aims to rectify the risk factors, okay? Whereas proactive intervention would be those that would be done as a result of a past incidents. For example, spot policing, because I know that area is already under crime area, it's a high crime area, so I do spot policing. So that's a proactive intervention. Whereas reactive kind of an intervention is something which is which is usually done after something has happened in that area. So this is basically a 3D matrix that they show, and the different bubbles that you show here tells you the kind of effect the intervention had. For example, the red color, the triangle that you see, it shows that it was a negative intervention. So this is the only map that tells you what the intervention says. So one of the examples of that. Now, this is even more complicated. This is something called as 5D kind of an evidence and gap map, which was developed by an organization called Evidence-Based Synthesis Program. And again, it is a bit complicated to read, but it's a very, good evidence and gap map in terms of, because again, this also tells you, a bit on the effect sizes and all of that. I won't go into detail of this because, we have a lot to cover. But these are some few things that you can actually, go back and read in one of our comparison paper, which we have published. It's there on the Campbell library, which tells you about the, each of the methodology and the differences between each of these organizations. Now, let's look at the Campbell evidence and gap map. This is an example, and this is a map on violence against children by Campbell Collaboration. So what exactly you make out when you look at these different maps? So first thing is the color and the size of the bubble. So as I mentioned before, the color of the bubble tell you the type and the quality of evidence that is. For example, if you look at the one which I've highlighted here in the green, it tells you what is the type of the evidence and what is its quality. So this basically, for this evidence and gap map, we also quality rated the impact evaluation. So usually the red color, as similar to 3i organization, denotes that's a low quality review, and the green color corresponds to that's a high quality review. Also, the size of the bubble tells you the volume of the evidence. The larger the size means we have more evidence in that particular cell. That is the intersection of the interventions and the outcomes. Apart from that, an evidence and gap map, as I told you before, has some certain filters. These filters can be for region, population, study design, countries, or even the funding agencies. For example, in an evidence and gap map by Campbell, you have these filters. For example, if I only want to filter out evidence related to one of the high fragility countries like Afghanistan, you can select that country, click on update and click on close. Only the evidence that is available for Afghanistan would be visible in that screen. So it is very interactive. You can actually play around with different filters and identify the evidence that you want or that you're looking for as a researcher. Apart from that, an evidence and gap map will also have something called as user summaries and link to the sources. So you don't have to go anywhere else looking for the original source. You all have to click on the bubble, select the filter. For example, if you only want to see the low and medium quality systematic review, you can click on it and it will take you to another screen that will open up its user summaries. So we actually can't use the abstract because they have copyright issues and certain articles are paid. So instead of putting the abstract here, what we do is we create user summaries. So these summaries will give you information on study findings, what was the intervention being talked about, what was the outcome, and any other information such as funding agencies and all of that. So prepare a user summary so you can actually go and read about what that study was. You can also click on the source, like you can see the highlighted area. We have provided you the URL or the DOI. You can click on it and it will take you to the original source. So in one map itself, you can actually play around with different filters, read the user summaries, and actually go back and read the original source. Also, when you're looking at an evidence and gap map, you have to start thinking on how to use it. So first thing that it will tell you is what are the areas that are suitable for evidence synthesis. Like the one I've highlighted here in blue, you can see that these are only impact evaluations, low and medium quality and high quality. So what this area tells us that this particular area is actually ripe for evidence synthesis because I have good amount of impact evaluation here. So I can actually think about doing a systematic review in that area because you have, evidence in that. The second thing that an evidence and gap map will tell you are the evident gaps. So if you can see the area that I've highlighted here in red, you can see there's no bubble here at all. So something like this tells you that this area do not have any evidence. And if you do not see any bubbles at all, these are called areas of absolute gaps. So which helps us identify areas where you need to do more implementation research. Now, this particular example is by 3IE. So it can also help you identify areas of empty reviews. So the area which I've highlighted here, you can only see there's one colored bubble. That means there's only systematic review in that area. And when you open that, you will see that it's an empty review because you do not have any impact evaluation in that area. And if so it can also help you identify these areas where you do not have any impact evaluation, and you should not be commissioning or doing systematic review in such areas. So to summarize, why do we actually want evidence and gap map, or what are the main uses of evidence and gap maps? The first thing that it helps you identify, it helps guide users to available high quality evidence in the form of systematic reviews that can help inform strategies and program development. It will also tell users where there's no high quality evidence, so that a researcher can start thinking of doing high quality reviews in those areas. Third thing is, it also helps us identify the gaps that have to be filled either by evidence synthesis, where you do not have more reviews, or it helps us identify gaps that have to be filled by impact evaluation if there is an evident absolute gap. So in a way, it helps us set research priorities or funding priorities. Lastly, it helps us identify areas that that needs to have more studies to build the top level of evidence architecture. So what exactly is this evidence architecture? The graph that you see here on the screen, it's basically a supply graph, or we call it an evidence architecture in the form of knowledge brokering. So if you can see here, the evidence and gap map are an important building block in the evidence architecture. And as a result of this, evidence and gap map or mapping can be a means to end and commission more reviews, because we identify gaps in evidence synthesis using EGMs. It can also help us build evidence portals, and can also help us write guidelines and checklists. Why? Because you can only have evidence portals when you know that how much evidence is out there in that particular area, which is done by evidence and gap maps. So the question is, how exactly are evidence and gap map different from a review? If we have to look in points, for example, question setting. So systematic review, as you all know, they are narrower in scope, okay? And whereas evidence and gap map, they have to be broader in scope than systematic reviews. In terms of search strategy, so there's no difference between the search strategy of a systematic review and evidence and gap map, because both have to be as comprehensive as possible. In terms of screening and coding, again, for the screening, there's no difference. Again, for even an evidence and gap map, screening is done by 2 researchers, and the third researcher usually resolve the conflict. So it's a similar manner as you do for systematic review. The difference lies in coding, because for EGMs, obviously, because we are not trying to synthesize the evidence here, the coding is less. So we extract lesser data as compared to systematic reviews. And that is the reason why it's a bit quicker than systematic reviews. In terms of critical appraisal, so for critical appraisal for Campbell evidence and gap map, we encourage authors to do critical appraisal for systematic reviews. We have started doing critical appraisal even for impact evaluation for Campbell evidence and gap maps. Evidence synthesis, as I mentioned before, systematic review, the aim is because they synthesize the evidence, but typically for evidence and gap maps, we do not synthesize evidence. Reporting, so EGM, for an evidence and gap map, it's not that detailed. We only summarize what evidence is available out there. We do not go into, reporting whether interventions included in the evidence and gap map, they are effective or not effective. We do not do that while we are reporting it. The major difference also lies in terms of uses. So as you know that systematic reviews, they are the highest quality evidence and can be used to inform policies and practice, because it helps us, it tells us what is effective, what is not. But evidence and gap map can also help us inform research priorities. Why? Because it tells us where there is evidence and where there is no evidence. And it can also help us, prioritize research funding, because as a funder, if I look at an evidence and gap map, I would like to fund the areas which do not have evidence. Now let's look at the methodology. So this is the typical methodology for an evidence and gap map. As I mentioned before, and I'll emphasize again, the key step for an evidence and gap map is developing the scope, and that is nothing but your framework. So how do you get to this framework basically? So EGM framework has two dimensions, the primary dimensions and the secondary dimension, which are also called filter. So the primary dimension is formed by rows and columns, and these are usually interventions and outcomes. Whereas secondary dimensions, they are study designs, date of publication, country and region. It can be population subgroups as well. It can even be funding agencies and commissioning agencies. So why the framework matters, as I've been emphasizing again and again, because framework defines the scope of the map. That means what you should be including and what you should not be including. This framework will form the basis of your search strategy as well. This again will form the basis for your coding form. It will form the basis for your reporting as well. And it will also define how people will be viewing your findings. So you can see that framework is going to go through all the stages of evidence and gap map. That is why defining a framework should be done, with utmost careful and, with a lot of stakeholder buy-ins. So where do you find this framework? So the first thing is either use an existing framework which commands consensus. For example, you don't have that for your topic area, then you can identify the framework using key global strategy documents. If that is also not available, then you can go back and look at some of the key strategy documents from your funder. If that is also not there, or if the EGM is not funded, then you have to go back and look at the objectives of the project documents. If that is also not available, then you have to work with the funders and use a lot of stakeholder consultation. But again, I have to emphasize that for evidence and gap map, to get to the framework, even if you have an existing framework, stakeholder consultation is a very important step because it helps increase the usability of your evidence and gap map. So let's look at some of the examples of all the steps that I showed you. So existing framework, for example, we did one map on disability or people with disabilities, and we used WHO's community-based rehabilitation matrix for both interventions and outcome because it's a universally used matrix, and we straight away took this matrix and formed our interventions and outcome category. Another example is funder framework. We did one map which was funded by UNICEF on child welfare in low-income countries. So for this, we used UNICEF's strategic goals as one of the framework. We modified the intervention categories and subcategories based on stakeholder buy-ins, but we did use UNICEF's strategic framework for that. Another example of how we use project documents. For this violence against children map, we reviewed a lot of organizations like DFID, UNDP, World Bank, and after reviewing all of these documents, we came to the framework of violence against children. Lastly, stakeholder consultation. So we did one of the map from homelessness in high income countries. And for this, there is no particular strategy documents that's available. So what we did was there were several rounds of stakeholder consultations that were done to get to the framework of interventions and outcomes. I hope this is clear. We can discuss more when we are doing the questions and answers round. Now, looking at all of the stages and how we use evidence and gap map, let me take you through some of the key innovations that we have done in evidence mapping. So some of the important point is evidence and gap map, they're not only restricted to effectiveness kind of maps. It can be applied to a range of research questions. For example, some of the examples that I'll be taking you through are map of maps, mega map, effectiveness map, homelessness process map, Uganda country map, and Emana EGMs. So let's look at each of these and what was the innovation done in it one by one. If we talk about map of maps, it's basically a map of effectiveness of international development. So in this, what we did was, it was again a very, very large scope, and we included all the international development interventions in this map. Please note that this map only included evidence maps. It did not include systematic reviews or impact evaluation because the scope was extremely broad. So you can see that this was a snapshot from map of maps. it included all the sustainable development goal and all the international development interventions. So it was a very broad in itself, and we were able to identify 55 completed and 18 ongoing evidence and gap map. This was done in collaboration with 3IE, and this is not a Campbell map. But you can see that the scope is really, really broad, and the aim was to collate all the evidence gap maps that have been done so far. So what happened as a result of this map? We were able to identify priority areas for doing evidence and gap maps. So the result from this map was we were able to commission disability, transport, and access to justice. So 3 maps were commissioned as a result of this map. Another example is mega map in child welfare. Again, this is a very broad map, because if you imagine child welfare intervention included all the interventions that are there for child well-being, like education, like health, like social protection, like governance. So it was again a very, very broad map. And for this, we included only systematic reviews. So again, as I mentioned, it had a very large scope because it included all the interventions for child well-being. So this is a snapshot of this map, of the map on Mega Map. As I told you, it had all the interventions related to child well-being, and we had the outcomes like health, healthy development, education, and safety and risk factor. The color coding here is typical on like traffic color signal, as I mentioned before, with green being the highest quality evidence. As a result of this map, we were again able to identify priority areas to commission more evidence in gap maps. So we identified there was a huge gap in areas such as child abuse, governance, and equity, and violence against children evidence in gap map is the result of this particular map. Another example is on effectiveness, that is homelessness map. This is again a very broad map because it included all the interventions on homelessness. But what was the innovation done in this map was that we, for the first time, we critically appraised all the included studies, including the primary studies. So how did we coded these, these evidence? So systematic reviews were coded using a checklist called AMSTAR2, whereas your primary studies or impact evaluation were coded using a modified risk of bias tool, which was developed in-house, and we got them validated after a lot of expert consultations. So this particular map included close to 238 impact evaluations. So as a result of this map, a lot of priority areas were identified which did not have evidence, and there are 3 ongoing reviews that have been identified as a result of this map. So as a next step, or as a second map on the homelessness was developed on process evaluation, because we wanted to identify the barriers and facilitators to interventions that are done for homeless people. So again, the scope was pretty broad because all the process evaluation had to be identified. The innovation was in terms of search strategy, because for this map, the most of the process evaluations were identified using gray literature or website searches, as in contrast to your typical database searches. And of course, the columns, instead of your outcomes, were barriers and facilitators. So this is a typical snapshot of homelessness facilitator map. So as a result of this, mixed method systematic reviews is in the planning stages that will become commissioned, as well as there is an intervention tool called evidence portals that was developed as a result of this map. It is not entirely complete, but you can imagine as a result of this particular map, we went on to develop an evidence portal. Thirdly, our evidence and gap map on country map. So basically in this map, it was the innovation, first of all, was that this was restricted to a country. And the aim was to collate all the evaluations that have been done in Uganda from the year 2000 to year 2018. So scope was again a bit broad because it included all the evaluations in Uganda. And what do you mean by all the evaluations means that included process evaluation, impact evaluation, as well as formative evaluations. So this is the typical evidence and gap map that we did on Uganda country. And when we initiated this map, we were not sure that we will be able to capture so many evaluations, because the rough estimate that was given by some of the key consultants in those areas were close to 100. But we came to identify more than 600 evaluations in Uganda. So you can see it captured 269 process evaluation, 207 impact evaluation, and 7 formative evaluations. So what happened as a result of this? There are areas of, where you have a lot of evidence, you have to do a country level synthesis. There's an ongoing discussion on this. Also in the area of evident gap maps, there's ongoing discussion of, doing more evaluations in those areas. So as a result, at Campbell website, you can see that we have close to 20 evidence and gap map that have been published in Campbell library now. And the range of topic varies. So it's not restricted only to a particular topic. They are right from child abuse to social protection to gender equality, tobacco control, access to justice. So the topics, as well as the range of innovations that Campbell has done, and the kind of EGMs that you can see in the Campbell library, they are varied in terms of their scope as well as in terms of their topic. So some of the key takeaway points that I can emphasize from this presentation is EGMs, they are interactive tools that make the evidence more discoverable, accessible, and usable. I have already mentioned how they do that, because in one page itself, in an interactive platform, you have all the evidence for that particular sector, and you can actually play around with a lot of filters to identify evidence and identify areas that do not have evidence, which are called as gaps. So again, emphasizing EGMs are interactive visual tools, and the main purpose is to make the evidence discoverable, accessible, and usable to all the researchers. Also, evidence and gap map, they are not restricted to only the effectiveness kind of maps. They can be applied to a range of research questions. Also, the relevant evidence that you include in evidence depends on the type of research question that you're using. Also, as I mentioned before, EGMs, they are building block in the evidence architecture. And after doing an evidence and gap map, you can actually think of moving ahead of the evidence architecture pyramid. So as I mentioned before, if you want to read about different organizations that have done evidence mapping, you can go back and read this paper on evidence and gap map. It was a comparison paper that we have published. You can find it in the library, Campbell Library. And I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to your questions now. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ashrita. That was very interesting and certainly a great overview of what seems to be a very versatile and very useful tools as well. So we have a couple of questions coming in here. First one, we've one from Amy. How do you find evidence maps for maps of maps?
Okay, so does the question talk about this, if it's about the systematic search? So I'm not sure if the question is about how you do the searching. If that's the question, basically the search strategy for these will include terms that are more relevant to evidence mapping. Like we have different variants of evidence gap map, as I told you, and everyone has a different systematic, methodology of coining their terms. So some call it systematic mapping, some call it evidence map, some call it evidence and gap map. So you have to use all of those terminology. And the searches you have to do in database searches as well as there are list of, websites or list of organizations that have already done a lot of evidence mapping. So you have to go back and search their websites as well. So that's how you do that.
Okay, so it's specific organizations rather than like a database that you can go to search for evidence gap maps.
Yes.
Okay. And then what checklist do you use for critical appraisal of impact evaluations?
Okay, so it's a modified risk of bias tool that we use. We developed it and we got it validated by experts, and then you also pilot that same tool using at least set of 30 to 50 studies. After that, that tool was finalized. Okay.
I see Andres Couto has some questions. So Andres, if you want to type your questions, they're coming up here in the chat. Okay, so our research team has been commissioned by a governmental authority to conduct a landscape and knowledge map analysis on a certain topic. We have created a map in the form of an Excel spreadsheet. Can I transform it to an EGM using your method?
Okay, so I'll take you through the software that we use to develop this. So the top software is developed by organization called Epi Reviewer, and the software is called Epi Reviewer. So what you can do is, if you want to develop it in an online map, you have to transfer your coding that you have done in the Excel onto the Epi Reviewer, and that can easily be transferred and into the mapping utility to generate the map. So the first step would be to transfer all of that coding that you have done into the Epi Reviewer.
Okay, great. We've had a couple of questions here on, are your maps regularly updated, and if so, how often?
Okay, so the answer would be yes, they are, but that also depends on the resources and the funding we have. So typically, we do encourage maps to be updated yearly, but that also, as I mentioned, there can be resource restrictions or limitations on that. And how means, or you have to update the searches and run the searches again. So we recently did it for homelessness map. It's ongoing. So you have to update the search strategy, and then you have to run it again into the Epi Reviewer to see how many new studies you have captured in that.
Okay. And there was a question on what software do you use to host the maps? Is that the same software?
Yes,
the Epi Reviewer as well. Okay, great. There was a question there just about maybe a gap. So there was work being done on policy relevant evidence maps by the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in Africa. Are you aware of that research or that work?
Yes.
Great, yes.
Definitely, we are very much aware of that. And I don't know what exactly was the question, but no, it wasn't intentional, because we cannot show all the examples. As I mentioned, there are more than 18 organizations that are now doing evidence mapping. So I couldn't carry all of that and show it here, but there are a lot of obviously we are aware of that.
Sure, great. And then another question is the Epi Reviewer free? And does it provide open access as well?
Okay, so for the Campbell maps, if you register with Campbell, your topics, it would be you will be given the free access of Epi Review. Otherwise, it's a paid software.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit more about your stakeholder consultation for your evidence gap maps and how you do that?
Okay, so the first key thing that we do is once you start with a map, or you've identified a topic, the first key thing that we do is we do some of the background research, and we help identify some of the key frameworks that we have already for that, and if we have existing one, or we at least list down the key interventions in the form of an Excel sheet. The next thing is we usually try and have a stakeholder consultation in the form of a workshop. We do that and we encourage that, so that it's an open workshop where you have key stakeholders for that topic sitting together. It could be funders, it could be researchers, or it could be the end users, and we present the first draft framework in front of them, and we encourage them to comment on it, on each of the interventions. And it could be the comment on definitions, comment on the various grouping that we have done for interventions, and outcome subcategories or the categories. Based on that, we again refine the map based on that stakeholder workshop that we do, and that revised framework is again sent across to different stakeholders through emails, and again we try and wait for their feedback so that we come back and refine it again. So as I mentioned, it involves a lot of stages where you do the workshop for stakeholder consultation, as well as you run it through a lot of emails and a lot of phone calls, and try and get to the framework that is standard and that would be used by a lot of users.
That's great. I've another just a short question. Can Epi Reviewer be used for scoping reviews?
Yes, you can. So you can of course use the Epi Reviewer for scoping reviews as well.
Great. Could you talk a little bit more about how, I know you've mentioned it in your presentation, but how evidence and gap maps can be used for research priorities and funding priorities?
Sure. So as I mentioned, evidence and gap map, when you look at a completed map, you would be able to identify areas which do not have any evidence. So for example, if I'm a researcher, I if you have this map, because the aim of, at Campbell, what we're trying to do is we're trying to generate these maps for range of topics so that any researcher can come back and look at these maps. So if I'm a researcher and I want to do a systematic reviews, I can look at these maps and identify areas which have good amount of impact evaluation, but do not have systematic reviews in those areas. So the key thing is these maps can help us avoid duplications as well, because the reason is in this evidence gap map, we also project ongoing research. What happens is, if you don't, in the absence of evidence in gap map, there are a lot of duplication in terms of research. For example, I started a review in one topic and another university also started a review in the same topic, in the same context. So the efforts are wasted and duplicated. But if you choose your topics using these evidence gap map, you will know that someone is already doing a review or say primary study in that area. So you need not duplicate that efforts. So that's how you can look at research priorities. Whereas even for the funding priorities, like sometimes even the funding agency, they commission the same kind of research. But if you have something like an EGM, you can, select your priorities and, can fund the areas that is most relevant to you and that is visible, and that can be used widely by everyone in that areas.
Great. More questions are coming in, and please, if you do have questions, please type them in as we're continuing. So on your published maps, do you provide the list of sources for where you searched for evidence and or the protocol anyway?
Okay, that's a good question. So, any evidence in gap map is accompanied by a report, an EGM report, and in that report we mention everything related to the searches, the list of excluded studies and list of included studies. All that information you can go and find in the published EGM reports, but we do not provide that in the online map per se.
We have one more question about the EPI reviewers. So I understand first I register my topic with the Campbell Collaboration and then I can use the EPI reviewer for free?
Yes, you will be given access.
Great. Can I ask a question about the time, of how long does it take to complete an EGM?
Okay, so it's typically 4 to 6 months.
Okay, so it's a little shorter than
Yeah.
a systematic review, although it is just as rigorous with the methodology.
Yes, the only difference lies in, the kind of data we are extracting. So that is a bit quicker.
So would you recommend people would do this before they do their systematic review?
That's the whole idea of it, because if you have something like this, it's more like in scoping and you know where you need to put your efforts in and where exactly reviews are needed or where exactly we require implementation research.
Sure.
So there are a lot of organizations like Campbell 3i that have already done EGMs. So you should definitely go back and look at those EGMs and identify areas if someone has already done a research in those areas or someone is already doing or it's an ongoing research in those areas. That should definitely be done.
Great. So at the beginning of your presentation, when you had the list of, was it 14 organizations that were—
Yeah, now more than that actually, because when we did this paper, some of the organizations did not started doing, but yeah, there are more than that, more than 20 organizations now.
Great. A couple more questions coming in. Is your impact evaluation checklist available for anyone to use?
Yeah, I would say yes, but you have to, that also depends on the kind of map that you're developing. If it's a impact evaluation or it's an effectiveness kind of map, you can definitely use it. But if it's something else, that won't be applicable for you. So you need to test it for your research topic, research question, of course.
How much time is needed if the protocol is written, the evidence is already there and the information is extracted, and Andros has about 130 pieces of evidence?
You mean you have already done the scoping, you have already done the searches, and if you mean, putting your coded data into EPI preview and getting the map out, it won't take you more than 1 month. But if you mean right from starting the searches, then it's 4 to 6 months, as I mentioned before. But everything is already done. It should not take you more than 1 month to get it done.
Okay, that's great. So have we any further questions? I think we've answered everything. So just thank you everybody again for your interaction. And thank you so much, Ashrita, for a really engaging presentation and for all your time and your effort that you've put this into. So I will put the recording of this up on our website, www.evidencesynthesisireland.ie. So you'll be able to look back over it and use the information that Ashrita has published on her presentation. So that's going to be a really useful resource. And we will share this as well on our Twitter for people who couldn't attend live today. So you can sign up to our newsletter on our website as well. And you can get a notification of our upcoming webinars or training. And you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn as well. We will be sending around a feedback survey at the end, and we would really appreciate if you could fill that out so that we can know as well what topics you're interested in the future. And I would just like to say thank you again to Ashrita for an excellent webinar. And thank you all again, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.